Hello all, put on your thinking caps because today I'm going to be talking about nerve cells, also known as neurons. Neurons are unable to go through a process known as mitosis in which cells replicate. So, you are born with all the neurons you're going to get. That means be careful with yourself. The cell begins with its dendrites. Dendrites is where information is received. From there, the information is sent into the soma, which contains the neuron's nucleus as well as other organelles. From the soma, the information is sent down the axon, which is more often than not surrounded by myelin sheath. Myelin sheath acts as an information lubricant by accelerating the pace at which the information travels down the axon. Finally, the information travels into the synaptic terminals, where it is transported away from the neuron into the body. Within the axon, we find potassium ions, which we will use its periodic symbol K to represent. Along with potassium, we find negatively charged proteins within the axon. Surrounding our axon, we find sodium and chlorine ions. Put the two together and you have sodium chloride, aka salt, surrounding potassium, which is found in bananas, thus the nickname salty banana. There are two states in which a neuron could be in. The first is resting potential. Resting potential is when the neuron lies dormant and no messages or information are traveling through the neuron. The charges of the ions are just as important. On the outside, we have positively charged sodium, and on the inside, we also have positively charged potassium. So why is the inside negative, but the outside positive? Well, the number of sodium ions outweigh the number of potassium ions, making the outside positively charged. Resting potential still requires energy, as the sodium-potassium pump needs to be powered. For every 3 sodium that leave the axon, 2 potassium enter the axon, helping to maintain the polarized neuron. The second process that the neuron undergoes is called action potential. Now, action potential involves the ions that we talked about and many other moving parts. The catalyst for action potential is when a stimulus is received from a sensory cell or other neuron. Prior to stimulus, a neuron's voltage is negative 70 millivolts. During a process called depolarization, the neuron increases in voltage to what should say negative 55 millivolts, which is also known as the threshold. Once the threshold is reached, a previously closed sodium channel will open up and let in all of the sodium that was previously on the outside of the axon, making the neuron positively charged, or rather depolarized. As the positively charged sodium ions enter the axon, the charge of the neuron goes up, and once it reaches a positive 30 millivolts, another channel for potassium opens up, and then the potassium ions go out during a process called repolarization. The potassium ions go out in such high numbers trying to repolarize the neuron that it ends up sending the neuron into a process called hyperpolarization. Hyperpolarization is when the charge of a neuron goes below its resting potential charge of negative 70 millivolts. In order for hyperpolarization to stop and the neuron to go back to resting potential at negative 70 millivolts, both the sodium and potassium channels close and the sodium-potassium pump is opened. For every 3 sodium ions that leave the axon, 2 potassium ions enter the axon.